Welcome to VSOW, where we take a deep dive into the most enduring and contested ideas that shape our modern world. Today, we are opening a vast file, really digging into the concept of monarchy. And we're looking at it not just as, a historical system, but as an idea that's been constantly challenged, constantly debated for centuries, from its rejection during the Enlightenment right up to the kinds of protest movements we actually see today.
That's right. And we've gathered a pretty substantial stack of sources for you here. We've got things ranging from, well, the revolutionary clarity of primary documents like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which is just fascinating reading. We also have deeper philosophical analyses looking into the divine right of kings, for example. Plus, rigorous contemporary moral arguments from academics today, and even the really highly charged political framing we see in recent, no kings organizing efforts.
Okay, so our mission here is pretty ambitious. We want to synthesize all this diverse material. The goal is to give you a complete picture of the intellectual lineage of republicanism, essentially. We're mapping out the core arguments for abolishing hereditary rule, looking at both the ancient philosophical roots and the very immediate, very practical political applications of this whole debate, all for you, the well-informed learner.
And what's really striking, I think, across all these different sources is how the fundamental issues just haven't changed much over hundreds of years. It doesn't really matter if the monarch has absolute power or just, a purely ceremonial role. We're still grappling with these core conflicts:
Mhm.
legitimacy, moral equality, and the nature of concentrated political power. So, to really understand the case against kings, we absolutely have to start by examining the doctrine that underpinned centuries of rule. That's the divine right of kings. And then naturally the Enlightenment response that followed, which started defining government as more of a functional, maybe even a necessary evil.
Okay, let's definitely unpack that historical bedrock. Because for centuries, the monarch's authority wasn't just political, right? It was seen as sacred. It was rooted in this idea, the divine right of kings, or DRK, as it's sometimes called. And this wasn't just a suggestion of power, was it? It was presented as a full-on theological and political mandate.
Oh, absolutely. It was a profoundly powerful tool for control. Because what it did was take earthly power and make it seem inviolable, essentially positioning its source completely outside of human intervention. Source 3 really lays this out clearly. DRA asserts that a monarch is subject only to God's authority. They're exempt from any earthly accountability. That means no subject, no political party, not even the established church could legitimately challenge the throne.
Wow. And the practical implication of that is just staggering when you think about it. Resisting the king was therefore framed as what? Directly resisting God's will.
Exactly. And resisting God's will in that historical context, well, that carried the ultimate penalty, spiritual damnation. You can even see this belief captured, maybe a bit satirically, in that famous 18th century song, The Vicar of Bray. There's that definitive line, "And damned are those who dare resist or touch the Lord's anointed." Include. That phrasing really shows the kind of psychological weight the doctrine put on every single subject.
Right. And to keep this doctrine going, its proponents needed, well, it sounds like they needed a pretty rigorous, sometimes even fabricated, historical narrative. We see this really spectacularly with the claims made by Sir Robert Filmer, the 17th century English royalist.
Filmer's claim was, well, it was an extraordinary attempt to give monarchy this deep historical legitimacy. He argued the state was just like an expanded family, the king was its father figure, and then he proclaimed, quite fantastically actually, that King Charles I of England was the oldest living heir of Adam. That was his literal justification for perpetual inherited rule going all the way back.
That does sound like a dramatic leap of faith, maybe even, outright fabrication needed to maintain that narrative of unbroken legitimacy. How did the sources specifically critique Filmer's attempt to use scripture to back this up?
Well, the critique is pretty straightforward. His interpretation required him to stretch the biblical text way beyond any reasonable reading. Filmer tried to base his argument on Genesis 1.26, where Adam is granted dominion. But the text itself explicitly grants Adam dominion over the earth and the creatures of the earth. It doesn't say anything about dominion over other humans, especially since, no other humans actually existed at that precise moment in the text. Source 3 points this out as a classic example of someone trying to insert meaning into ancient scripture that the original author clearly didn't intend, all just to manufacture this continuous, legitimate, inherited line of power stretching right back to creation itself.
Okay, so Filmer's attempt to claim this divine mandate back to Adam was, well, it sounds like it was pretty effectively debunked by later Enlightenment thinkers. But then what Thomas Paine does seems far more revolutionary. He actually turns the very religious text the monarchs were relying on against them.
Yes, Paine was incredibly effective at this reversal. It's quite brilliant, actually.
Hmm.
Both Source 2 and Source 3 highlight how Paine meticulously uses the biblical history of Israel's request for a king. He uses it to demonstrate that monarchy wasn't some divine institution at all, but actually represented a human failing, a sin even. Paine points out that the Almighty's will, as it was conveyed through figures like Gideon and the prophet Samuel, expressly disapproved of government by kings.
Right, I remember that part. When the Israelites were facing oppression, they asked Gideon to rule over them as a king, and crucially, an hereditary king.
And Gideon flatly refused. He asserted very clearly, "The Lord shall rule over you."
So Paine uses that refusal as a kind of foundational moment of republicanism within Scripture itself.
Pretty much. And the rejection is even more explicit about 130 years later. The Israelites, wanting to be like all the other nations, they go to Samuel and demand a king. Samuel's displeased, he consults the Lord, and the Lord replies, and this is key, "They have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, then I should not reign over them."
Wow. So the sources really convey this request for a king as a profound act of, spiritual rejection.
Absolutely. It was framed as an evil act in the text. Now, the Lord eventually granted their request, but only with this really solemn and quite brutal warning, almost like a form of judgment. He warned that the king would oppress them, seize their sons for his chariots, their daughters for labor, their best fields for his servants. This history is crucial because Paine then uses it to declare that monarchy is ranked in Scripture as one of the sins of the Jews for which a curse in reserve is denounced. This just completely undermined the spiritual legitimacy the throne was claiming.
Okay, so having stripped monarchy of its divine legitimacy, Paine then pivots, right? He moves to a purely secular, pragmatic framework. He makes that distinction between society and government. Society, he argues, springs from our wants, our needs, and it promotes happiness by unifying us.
But government is different. It is, according to Paine, produced by human wickedness. It's fundamentally characterized as a necessary evil, even in its best state, and intolerable at its worst. He gives that wonderful analogy, doesn't he? Defining government, like dress, as the badge of lost innocence.
A badge of lost innocence. That's memorable. So if government is just a tool, then what's its true functional purpose?
Security. Its true end, its main goal, is security. Therefore, Paine applies this core pragmatic test. The form of government most likely to ensure that security with the least expense and greatest benefit is preferable to all others. And monarchy, in Paine's revolutionary view, wasn't just divinely disapproved of, it also failed this basic test of functionality and, well, cost-effectiveness.
Right. And Paine's argument, which you find detailed in Source 2, it moves really quickly from this sort of overarching philosophical critique to a very specific, very pragmatic attack on the English constitutional system of his time. He saw that system as incredibly complex, and he actually targeted that complexity as a major flaw, didn't he?
He definitely saw complexity as a kind of deliberate mask, a way to obscure responsibility. Paine argued that an absolute government, even though he thought it was a disgrace to human nature, is at least clear. If the people suffer, they know exactly whose head, the king's, is responsible, and they know the remedy that's needed.
But the English Constitution, he says, is designed to be opaque, deliberately confusing. It's so complex that the nation might suffer for years without ever really figuring out where the actual fault lies. Because the fault is spread out among different bodies, different political observers, the political physicians, as he calls them. They'll always advise a different cure. This sounds almost like an early critique of bureaucracy as its own form of tyranny.
That's precisely the implication, yes. He breaks the English system down into its component parts. He describes it as the base remains of two ancient tyrannies compounded with some new republican materials.
And those components are, let's see, the remnants of monarchical tyranny in the king,
Right.
aristocratical tyranny in the House of Peers,
Yep.
and then the new republican materials, which are vested in the commons.
Exactly. And here's where he presents this intellectual challenge. The first two parts, the king and the lords, they're hereditary. That means they exist independently of the people. They contribute nothing, in his view, to the freedom of the state. And Paine found the whole idea that these three powers could reciprocally check each other. Well, he called it farcical and logically incoherent, a flat contradiction.
That's a really powerful point about the internal inconsistency there. If the commons have the power to check the king, say, by withholding supplies, that implies the commons are wiser or more trustworthy than the crown itself.
Correct. That's the premise. But then Paine asks, if we accept that premise, Why does the same constitution give the king the power to veto the commons by rejecting their bills? That action assumes the exact opposite, that the king is somehow wiser than the very body the system has already suggested is more worthy of confidence. For Paine, this kind of circular logic makes the whole system a mere absurdity. It's like a self-canceling mechanism, designed perhaps not really to achieve balance, but maybe just to preserve entrenched power.
And beyond the system's logic, Paine also attacks the very function of the monarch himself. He concludes that the entire character, the role of the king, is inherently absurd and useless.
Yes, he notes there's something exceedingly ridiculous in the composition of monarchy, because the role demands that a man possess the absolute highest level of judgment, wisdom, and knowledge of the world. Yet the very status of being a king inherently excludes him from the means of getting that information. His position literally shuts him off from the world he's supposed to govern. So the requirements of the job directly contradict the insulated nature of the position itself. It just doesn't make sense to him.
And the system of hereditary succession just compounds this flaw, doesn't it? Paine argues that mankind was originally equal. So how then did this race of men come into the world so exalted above the rest, distinguished like some new species?
That rhetorical question really challenges the whole notion of inherited superiority, right? Paine certainly doesn't believe this hierarchy emerged through any noble means. He suggests hereditary succession probably began with the principal ruffian of some restless gang, someone who, through cunning and predation, violently consolidated power and just made himself chief.
He doesn't really hold back his contempt for the historical figures who established these monarchies, does he?
Not at all. He characterizes the founding of the English line with William the Conqueror in pretty brutal terms, describing his claim as a very paltry, rascally original, established by a French bastard landing with an armed banditti and establishing himself king of England against the consent of the natives. The conclusion is stark. There's no divinity in this origin story, just violence and theft.
Okay, so we've seen the moral flaws, the historical flaws he points out. But maybe the greatest practical flaw, according to Paine, is what hereditary rule does to the actual quality of governance itself, ensuring that those who end up reigning are often the most ignorant and unfit.
He argues it practically guarantees incompetence, because hereditary succession opens the door to the foolish, the wicked, and the improper. People born to reign are, in his words, early poisoned by importance, which insulates them from the necessary lessons of the real world. Paine's colorful language here is really memorable, isn't it? He suggests one of the strongest natural proofs of the folly of hereditary right is that nature disapproves it, otherwise she would not so frequently turn it into ridicule by giving mankind an ass for a lion.
An ass for a lion, ouch. But despite all this, the most plausible, maybe the most enduring, pragmatic defense of hereditary succession has always been that it preserves a nation from civil wars, by providing a clear, supposedly unquestioned line of authority.
And Paine utterly dismantles this argument. He calls it a barefaced falsity. This is where he brings in the historical evidence quite effectively. He specifically documents the history of England since the Norman Conquest to disprove this pragmatic plea. He notes that England endured no fewer than 8 civil wars and 19 rebellions during that period alone.
And to give that argument real weight, you have to remember the sheer chaos of the 15th century, right? The contest between the houses of York and Lancaster, the Wars of the Roses. That was a brutal, dynastic civil war fought entirely over succession and lasted for, 67 years. Generations were born and died knowing only bloodshed, all because the line of succession was contested.
Exactly. Paine's evidence demonstrates that far from guaranteeing peace, the very mechanism of monarchy and hereditary succession had laid not just England, but the world in blood and ashes, as he put it. He completely transforms the monarchy from this idea of a stabilizing force into what he sees as an inherent catalyst for conflict.
Wow. That detailed critique really serves as the ultimate demolition of the old system in his view. Okay, so if Paine provided the, let's say, the revolutionary hammer, then the later Enlightenment thinkers provided more like the architectural blueprints for a new system, one built on popular consent and shared legitimacy. We should probably transition now to those who helped actually build the alternative to hereditary rule.
Yes, that's a crucial shift. Moving from just challenging the right to rule to actually designing a system based on the consent of the governed. And we really have to start with John Locke here. His political philosophy provided the direct intellectual counterpoint to Filmer's claim that no man is born free.
Locke, of course, believed the exact opposite. All men are born free, equal, and independent. And he argued for constitutional government, where powers are limited and derive solely from the consent of the governed.
Right, and his rhetorical dismantling of Filmer was absolutely critical in establishing this new paradigm. Source 3 reminds us of Locke's really powerful mockery of those literal hereditary claims. Locke posed a simple but devastating question. If monarchy is truly about inheriting Adam's title, and if the true heir of Adam could somehow be found today, should all the existing kings across the globe immediately surrender their crowns and kingdoms to the single, rightful hereditary heir?
The implicit answer being, of course, that any existing king who refused to hand over power would, by Filmer's own logic, have to be seen as a usurper.
Precisely. So Locke exposed the entire basis of birthright authority as either, well, a joke or simply an act of theft. He demanded that political authority be justified on functional, rational grounds, not based on some mythical lineage.
Okay, so following Locke, we then see thinkers like Montesquieu reflecting on how best to actually structure power to prevent its abuse, which ultimately provided a lot of the framework for later Republican governance.
Montesquieu's work, especially his ideas on the separation of powers, was profoundly influential. Now, he was also studying how to prevent despotism, even within a monarchy, maybe by requiring intermediate powers like nobility or an independent judiciary. But his core insights about needing checks and balances, that power must check power, were absolutely foundational. They directly influenced the design of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches in the American system and beyond.
And then Rousseau comes along and shifts the focus a bit, doesn't he? From the individual consent that Locke talked about to the collective sovereignty of the community, the general will.
Yes, Rousseau's social contract theory is distinct. It focuses on this idea of a collective surrender of individual rights to the general will. This general will represents the sovereign legislative community. Its laws are designed to guarantee collective freedom. The key idea is that the law, being the product of this collective general will, fundamentally prevents tyranny because the community establishes laws that they themselves must obey. This ensures that no individual, and certainly no hereditary body, stands above the law. And these concepts, constitutionalism, separation of powers, popular sovereignty, they really are the architectural footing for the U.S. Constitution and for modern democratic republics all over the world.
Okay, so we have the revolutionary arguments, the architectural foundations laid out. Now let's move to the modern moral case against monarchy. Because even if a monarchy today is purely ceremonial, contemporary academics argue its mere existence violates core moral principles of modern democracy. The work of Christos Kyriakou seems particularly relevant here, based on our sources.
Yes, Kyriakou, highlighted in Source 5, argues pretty forcefully that even constitutional monarchy violates the fundamental principle of basic moral equality. This principle really undergirds representative democracy. Monarchy, by its very nature, treats monarchs and their families as morally superior to ordinary citizens, and this is based purely on the historical accident of their family lineage. This creates a kind of systemic inherited inequality that is just completely at odds with modern liberal democratic ideals.
But what about the argument for stability? Does the moral critique still hold the same weight if people feel the monarchy provides stability and national cohesion? Why should an abstract concept like, say, dignity or equality trump those pragmatic benefits like peace, which are often cited?
Well, that really is the core conflict, isn't it? The pragmatic versus the principled argument. The academic critique argues that morality must trump pragmatism here because the systemic violation of human dignity is simply too great a cost to pay. Kyriakou specifically draws on Immanuel Kant's philosophy to demonstrate this violation.
Okay, maybe we should pause there for a second just to quickly contextualize that Kantian principle for you, our listener.
Good idea. So Kant's concept of the categorical imperative, in simple terms, demands that persons must always be respected as ends in themselves. They should never be treated as mere means or tools for someone else's benefit or purpose. Now, in a monarchy, subjects pay taxes. Historically, they fought and died to defend the crown. The argument is that these subjects are being treated instrumentally. Their resources, even their lives, are used to provide for the monarch's inherited privileges and lifestyle. So, using citizens this way for the unmerited benefit of an inherited class is seen as fundamentally disrespectful and, well, undignified according to this Kantian view.
And that leads us directly to the core concept of justice and merit, right? The system fundamentally violates the principle of moral desert.
Precisely. Kiriakou further cites John Rawls's work on justice, specifically the idea that primary goods, things like income, wealth, status, should be distributed fairly within society. He also brings in Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous call for people to be judged by the content of our characters, not by, say, the color of their skin or, in this context, by their family name.
So monarchy gets criticized as inherently unmeritorious because it grants the ultimate primary goods, status, privilege, resources based solely on the accident of birth.
Exactly. It gets labeled as unmeritorious, nepotist, and unjust because status is derived entirely from this historical accident of family lineage. If you accept the premise of modern justice that your success, your rewards, should correlate somehow with your effort and contribution, then monarchy appears as a profound and perhaps unresolvable violation of that principle.
Let's circle back to that pragmatic defense for a moment, though, because it is quite powerful and persistent. George Orwell, who was obviously a very keen observer of political dynamics, he suggested the king acts as a kind of necessary escape valve for dangerous emotions, allowing real power to remain with the more mundane, competent politicians, those unprepossessing men in bowler hats, and thereby potentially averting things like fascism or extreme instability.
Orwell's point is definitely compelling. It suggests monarchy might be a kind of functional lie, almost a necessary distraction that keeps things stable. However, the moral rebuttal strongly contests the idea that constitutional monarchy is some kind of guaranteed safeguard for stability. History just provides too many clear counterexamples.
Like the potential for a monarch who actually wants political power.
Exactly. The sources point to the near crisis with Edward VIII back in 1936. He showed quite pronounced sympathy for National Socialism and clearly had political ambitions that clashed directly with the elected government. His accession to the throne was ultimately prevented more by, frankly, accident and luck surrounding his personal life than by the functional limits of the constitutional system itself.
And more broadly, the source material seems to argue that constitutional monarchy doesn't actually guarantee democratic stability at all.
Well, you just have to look at the example of Greece. Greece was a constitutional monarchy right up until 1967. The presence of the monarch absolutely did not prevent a military coup and the establishment of a military junta there. This demonstrates pretty clearly, I think, that relying on a sovereign to remain perfectly apolitical and benign is fundamentally a gamble. You're risking a severe failure in democratic governance.
Okay, so the argument concludes that even if stability were achieved through monarchy, the moral reasons against inherited privilege are just so strong that they should trump those pragmatic concerns. And furthermore, the supposed benefits like social cohesion, national pride, economic boosts from tourism, those can be achieved perfectly well without a monarchy.
Yes, the academic consensus presented in Source 5 is pretty clear on this. These benefits are equally and often very successfully promoted within Republican constitutional frameworks across Europe. They cite Italy, France, Germany as examples. Therefore, the institution of monarchy is ultimately framed in this critique as, well, an atavistic, unmeritorious, and unjust relic of a feudal past that modern political systems really should reject entirely.
Right, and this ongoing philosophical and moral battle really sets the stage for the political organizing we see today. We've traced the arguments from 1776 with Paine through the Enlightenment architects like Locke and Rousseau and into modern academia. So how do these deep-seated Republican ideas actually manifest in our very immediate modern political culture?
Well, they manifest quite powerfully in the digital sphere, for one. You see online communities like the subreddit Rebolish the Monarchy. Their stated aim is to actively dismantle popular monarchist myths and narratives among the general population. Their explicit target is what they call the class consciousness in a population that identifies with royals and even loves their subjugation by a hereditary monarchy.
Wow, the rhetoric there sounds intensely focused on liberation from both economic and psychological control.
It really is. The community often shares these very potent historical quotes that illustrate the depth of this anti-monarchy feeling, like the words of James Connolly, the Irish Republican. Monarchy is a survival of the tyranny imposed by the hand of greed and treachery upon the human race in the darkest and most ignorant days of our history.
That kind of language frames the monarchy not as some benign cultural institution, but as a deliberate act of, well, historical criminality.
And this philosophical opposition is sometimes coupled with quite inflammatory, maybe even hyperbolic revolutionary fervor. This is exemplified by another quote that's apparently favored on the forum. "Man will never be free until the last king is hanged with the entrails of the last priest." Unquote. Now, that's obviously extreme, but it demonstrates that for some, the abolition of monarchy is seen as a necessary first step towards achieving true, complete societal freedom.
And crucially, this modern sentiment seems constantly fed by contemporary controversies, things that bring that moral argument about desert and cost into sharp focus, making the older philosophical arguments feel very tangible and immediate.
Yes, absolutely. The content on that subreddit frequently highlights headlines reflecting public anger over financial expenditures, using phrases like, "that's our 12 mappers," to argue that public funds shouldn't be used to support inherited privilege. And the various controversies surrounding the legal and financial affairs of specific royal family members, like Prince Andrew, serve as major catalysts for this kind of sentiment.
Right. The discussions around Prince Andrew's titles, the allegations against him, the costs associated with him, as specifically urged for by Virginia Giuffre's brother in some reports, those provide activists with concrete, real-world examples. Proof points, really, for the older moral arguments that inherited privilege might allow individuals to act without the same accountability faced by ordinary citizens.
Exactly. These events just reinforce that central critique that inherited status can lead to unequal treatment before the law and requires the public to effectively pay for what is seen as unmerited, unjust status.
Okay, now, moving across the Atlantic, we saw this ancient philosophical argument mobilized on a massive scale in the United States recently with the No Kings movement. This wasn't just some historical reenactment society. This was a pretty potent American political organizing effort.
It really was. Source 4 suggests that the slogan itself, "No Kings," apparently coined by the progressive group 5E501, maybe growing out of a Reddit post initially, was so successful because it managed to bypass a lot of modern political polarization. It did this by tapping into a really deep historical echo for Americans. For Americans, the word king isn't really synonymous with a modern ceremonial figure. It's synonymous with King George III and the founding trauma of the Republic, that successful rejection of hereditary authoritarian rule.
So that historical frame allowed the movement to become a kind of seemingly nonpartisan rallying point against perceived autocracy in modern U.S. politics.
That seems to be the analysis, yes. And the mobilization itself was historic in scale. Sources estimate that coordinated marches across the U.S. were attended by roughly 5 million people nationwide. This wasn't just a few hundred people in the big cities. We saw colossal turnouts, 80,000 in Philadelphia, 75,000 in Chicago, 50,000 in New York. And significant protests even popped up in traditionally conservative states, which was quite notable.
And the tone, as noted in the sources, was often characterized by this sort of fun and frivolity, using jokey signs like, "the only orange monarch we want," or I think you mentioned the New Orleans specific one, "no kings, only king cake."
Yes, that lighthearted, almost carnival-like atmosphere seems to have been key to its mass appeal. It served as this massive, low-stakes entry point for participation. It allowed really diverse groups to unite under a broadly patriotic banner of anti-authoritarianism without necessarily requiring deep philosophical alignment on every issue.
But the very nature of this broad, massive mobilization also attracted significant and pretty pointed internal critique, particularly from the left.
Right, and this is where we see a kind of modern echo of Paine's critique of complexity, or maybe opacity. Some activists criticized the movement pretty sharply, calling it a cringy carnival of liberalism that lacked specific, coherent political demands. Source 5 contrasts this movement with historical actions, noting that movements like Votes for Women Now were incredibly specific and goal-oriented.
So the fear was that the No Kings movement risked becoming just performative resistance, utilizing powerful historical symbols without actually being anchored to a tangible political program.
Precisely. It was seen by some critics as potentially draining the concept of resistance of its meaning, risking it becoming an empty spectacle where people feel like they've participated in dissent, but without building any sustainable, power-changing organization behind it. And the cynicism was often fueled, or at least amplified, by high-level liberal endorsements.
Yeah, when you see high-profile establishment figures like Hillary Clinton or Nancy Pelosi, who famously ripped up the paper crown in a video publicly endorsing the movement, it does kind of reinforce the critique that the effort might be dominated by centrists who aren't necessarily likely to pursue the kind of systemic change the movement's more radical base might desire.
And this was highlighted, perhaps unintentionally, by certain figures associated with the movement itself, like Doug Emhoff holding that sign saying, "If Kamala had won, we'd be at brunch."
Huh.
It could be interpreted as suggesting a more performative, almost celebratory political gesture rather than serious, sustained organizing aimed at fundamental change.
And yet, The other side of the political spectrum treated this ostensibly performative movement as a really severe, almost existential threat. This is where the reaction becomes quite alarming, actually.
Absolutely. The Republican establishment and the Trump administration at the time responded with what seemed like disproportionate alarm and hostility. Despite the overwhelmingly peaceful nature of the demonstrations, you had figures like House Speaker Mike Johnson characterizing the protesters as the terrorist wing of the Democratic Party.
Which is. I mean, to characterize peaceful, historically themed political dissent in the U.S. as a terrorist wing carries a pretty disturbing implication for freedom of expression and the constitutional right to assembly, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And furthermore, you had figures like Attorney General Pam Bondi implying the protests were funded by Antifa. This aligns with the previous administration's broader efforts to potentially designate Antifa as a terrorist organization, which could provide a pretext for cracking down on almost any perceived dissent, regardless of how peaceful or symbolically framed it might be. This strong political reaction really shows that the historical echo of that No Kings slogan, that symbolic rejection of autocracy, still holds immense political weight, enough to genuinely rattle the establishment.
Even President Trump himself weighed in, didn't he? Trolling the protesters by posting that AI-generated video of himself wearing a crown while piloting a jet labeled King Trump, which ironically highlights the very concept that protesters were warning against, the tendency towards autocracy and the sort of self-aggrandizement of power.
Indeed. So the synthesis here, really drawing from our sources, seems to be this. The historical resonance of No Kings is incredibly effective at mass mobilization. It can draw disparate groups together under this banner of anti-authoritarian patriotism. However, as those internal critiques suggest, this mobilization risks becoming an empty spectacle if the energy generated isn't effectively coupled with sustained, power-building organization aimed at specific, systemic political goals. The challenge, it seems, is translating that powerful historical sentiment into concrete, modern Republican policy and action.
Okay, so after diving deep into all of this, what does it all mean for us today? Our exploration reveals that the argument against monarchy, whether you base it on the ancient rights of man, the sheer absurdity of hereditary succession, or modern moral principles of equality and dignity, it remains a really potent organizing and philosophical force. It forces us, even today, to confront the legitimacy of inherited power. It makes the issue central to modern self-governance and that constant push towards a more just political order.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the fundamental conflict that we saw starting with Filmer and Paine, it really is timeless. Where does legitimate authority truly reside? Is it derived from birthright and some kind of divine approval? Or is it fundamentally rooted in the informed free will of the people being governed? The long arc of history, certainly supported by the philosophical blueprints laid out by Locke and Rousseau and others, does seem to suggest an inexorable bend towards the latter, with constitutionalism and moral equality emerging as the eventual, though perhaps still contested, winners.
Thomas Paine famously believed that America's cause back in 1776 was actually the cause of all mankind. He argued that separation from monarchy was necessary to open up an asylum for mankind against oppression. So given the near global adoption of Republican ideals in various forms since then, we're left to ponder this final thought for you. Is the persistence of monarchy in some nations today simply a testament to cultural resilience and maybe benign tradition? Or is it perhaps merely a temporary delay in what might be an inevitable worldwide progress toward full political equality and self-determination for all? If you enjoyed this deep dive into political philosophy, history, and protest, please make sure to subscribe, like, and maybe leave a comment on this deep dive.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.